At Sterling Medical Center, people paid $50,000 a plate to prove they cared about children's hearts.
Outside, the fog pressed against the city. Inside, every surface glittered like nothing could go wrong.
Just be patient, narrator. Lucas smiled when adults told him to smile, but every few minutes, he looked toward the pediatric wing.
You're doing great, sweetheart. Can we go see the kids later? Will the children get pancakes after surgery? Yes. If the doctors allow it, I'll make sure.
Behind the curtain, almost no one noticed the man keeping the microphones alive.
To them, Caleb Reed was maintenance. To his daughter, he was home. To the past, he was a man still hearing alarms no one else could hear.
Before this hospital, Caleb had learned one rule the hard way. The body tells the truth in pressure, color, rhythm, temperature, and silence.
Caleb. 3 years earlier, he saw something that did not fit. And he stayed quiet.
That night, Caleb wanted only to finish his shift, buy milk, and go home to his daughter.
Something's wrong.
It was not dramatic. That was why everyone else missed it.
At Sterling Medical Center in San Francisco, people had paid $50,000 a plate to prove they cared about children's hearts. They arrived in black cars that slid up to the glass entrance without a sound. They stepped out beneath warm lights, shook hands with hospital executives, and moved through the lobby as if the building itself had been polished for them. Outside, the fog pressed softly against the city. Inside, the grand atrium glittered with champagne glasses, gold donation cards, and a stage built beneath a banner that read, "One More Heartbeat." The woman standing at the center of it all was Eleanor Vance. In public, Eleanor was known as the kind of woman who made whole markets move before breakfast. She had built a technology company from a narrow office above a laundromat into an empire that powered hospitals, schools, and emergency systems across the country. People called her brilliant, ruthless, generous, impossible to intimidate. But that night, beneath the diamonds, the silk, and the careful smile, Eleanor was not thinking about markets. She was thinking about a small boy in a navy suit who kept tugging at his collar. Lucas Vance was 8 years old, thin for his age, restless, in the way children become restless when adults keep telling them to be patient. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's soft, serious eyes, though his father had been gone since Lucas was too young to remember him clearly. He stood near one of the side tables, turning a folded napkin into a paper bird, while donors walked past him and told Eleanor what a handsome young man he was becoming. Lucas smiled when he was told to smile. He thanked people when his mother touched his shoulder. But every few minutes he glanced toward the hallway that led to the pediatric wing. He knew why the gala mattered. Eleanor had explained it to him in gentle words that morning while helping him fasten his cuff buttons. Some children were born with hearts that had to fight harder than other hearts. Some families could not afford the tests, the surgery, the long nights in hospital rooms where every beep sounded like a question. The money raised that evening would give those children another chance. Lucas had nodded seriously. Then he had asked if those children would be allowed to have pancakes after surgery. Eleanor had laughed because she needed to laugh. She told him yes, if the doctors allowed it, she would personally make sure there were pancakes. That was the version of her the public rarely saw. Not the billionaire, not the founder, not the woman with the clipped voice and the perfect posture. Just a mother who still checked her son's breathing when he slept. Across the ballroom, behind a curtain near the audio control table, Caleb Reed tightened a cable with one hand and held a small flashlight between his teeth. No one looked at him for more than a second. That was normal. In places like Sterling Medical Center, the maintenance staff moved through rooms the way wiring moved through walls. Always needed, almost never noticed. Caleb wore a faded gray work shirt with his name stitched above the pocket, a hospital badge clipped to his belt, and boots old enough to remember other cities. His hands were broad, scarred, and steady. There was a pale line across one knuckle from a piece of shrapnel he never talked about, and a burn mark near his wrist from a generator fire outside Mosul that nobody in the ballroom would ever ask about. To the donors, he was the man making sure the microphones worked. To the hospital administrators, he was dependable, quiet, and unlikely to cause trouble. To his daughter, he was the father who packed lunches with uneven peanut butter, sang badly while making eggs, and always checked the locks twice before bed. Before all of that, Caleb had been a Navy corpsman attached to Special Operations Rescue Teams. He had knelt in sand smoke and blood, with rounds cutting the air above him. He had kept men alive with equipment that barely worked. He had read heart rhythms under red light inside helicopters that shook so hard his teeth hurt. He had learned in the roughest possible way that a body did not care about rank, money, or confidence. A body told the truth in pressure, color, rhythm, temperature, and silence. Then he came home. Coming home was supposed to mean peace. For a while it almost did. He married Grace, the woman who could make a grocery aisle feel like a Sunday morning. They had a daughter named Lily, who arrived with a furious cry and a grip so strong, Caleb joked that she had his field medic hands. He took contract work at first, then hospital maintenance, because it paid steady, kept him close to medical people without putting him back inside the kind of responsibility that had followed him home from war. Grace understood that. She understood the nights when Caleb woke suddenly and listened for sounds that were not there. She understood why he stood with his back to walls and restaurants. She never demanded stories he could not tell. Instead, she built ordinary life around him, patiently, piece by piece, until he began to believe quiet could hold. Then, 3 years before the gala, Grace died in the same hospital system where Caleb now fixed lights, vents, monitors, and soundboards. The official words had been complicated, a rare complication, an unfortunate presentation, symptoms that overlapped with something less dangerous until they did not. Caleb remembered almost none of the official words clearly. What he remembered was her hand in his. He remembered a nurse telling him the doctors were doing everything they could. He remembered looking at the monitor and feeling something inside him go cold because the rhythm did not match the explanation he had been given. He remembered noticing her skin, her breathing, the way she kept trying to say his name but could not get enough air behind it. He remembered thinking, say something, but he had not. He had stood there in civilian clothes, no longer wearing a uniform, no longer in a field hospital, no longer the man people turned to when the room fell apart. He had told himself the specialists knew more. He had told himself he was traumatized, overreacting, seeing patterns because fear wanted him to see them. He had told himself the worst thing he could do was interrupt, so he stayed quiet. By morning, Grace was gone. Since then, Caleb had lived with a question that never aged. Not one of those dramatic questions people imagine in grief, but a simple, blunt one that waited for him in the shower, in traffic, at the kitchen sink beside Lily's bed. What if I had spoken? No answer ever came. So he stopped asking out loud. He went to work. He fixed broken things. He raised his daughter. He avoided the emergency department when he could. He did not volunteer his past. He let people believe he was only what they saw. That night at the gala, he preferred it that way. He finished securing the sound cable just as Eleanor stepped onto the stage. The ballroom quieted with the practiced obedience of people who understood power. A video had just ended on the large screen behind her, showing children in recovery rooms, parents crying softly beside beds, surgeons bent over bright operating lights. The last image was of a toddler pressing a sticker onto a donation wall with both hands. The room, so loud minutes earlier, had gone tender. Eleanor stood at the microphone and let the silence breathe. She thanked the doctors. She thanked the nurses. She thanked the families who had trusted Sterling with the most fragile lives imaginable. Her voice did not tremble. But Caleb, from his place by the curtain, noticed the way her fingers touched the edge of the podium, when she mentioned the parents who waited through surgery. He knew that grip. The body did not lie. When Eleanor spoke of the new pediatric cardiac unit, donors leaned forward. They liked scale. They liked naming rights. They liked knowing their generosity could be carved into glass or printed in annual reports. Eleanor knew this, and she used it well. She turned grief into infrastructure, fear into funding, love into action. By the time she finished, the first paddle went up for $1 million, then another, then 5. The room burst into applause, warm and expensive. Caleb stepped behind the curtain again and coiled a spare cable. His job was almost done. If nothing failed in the next hour, he could slip out through the service corridor, clock out, pick up groceries before the late store closed, and still be home in time to hear Lily's summary of the chapter book she was pretending not to enjoy. He was thinking about whether they still had milk when he noticed Lucas. The boy had drifted away from the cluster of adults around his mother. He stood near the wide entrance to the ballroom, where servers passed with trays and guests moved in and out between speeches. Lucas was holding his paper napkin bird in one hand. With the other, he rubbed the center of his chest through his little suit jacket. It was not dramatic, not the kind of gesture that would pull attention in a room full of adults performing concern for one another. But Caleb saw it. The boy took a breath, then another slightly deeper. His face tightened for less than a second. Then one of the board members leaned down, said something to him, and Lucas smiled politely. Caleb's hands slowed on the cable. A server stepped in front of his view. When the server moved, Lucas looked normal again. A little pale, maybe, but children got tired at adult events. Caleb told himself that. He told himself a lot of things in the span of 3 seconds. Then the applause swelled again. A man in a midnight blue tuxedo hurried toward the entrance while looking back over his shoulder. Caleb recognized him from the donor wall. Derek Shaw, venture capitalist, loud laugh, heavy watch. The kind of man who donated in public and complained in private when the valet took too long. Derek had a glass in one hand and his phone in the other. He was turning away from someone calling his name when his shoulder and elbow drove straight into Lucas's chest. The impact made a small, ugly sound, not loud enough to silence the room, just enough for Caleb to hear it, because his body still listened for the wrong things. Lucas stumbled backward. The paper bird fell from his fingers. Derek caught him by one arm, gave a quick smile that said, "No harm done," and looked immediately around to see who had noticed. A woman nearby gasped, then relaxed when Lucas stayed on his feet. Derek said something quick to the boy, something that seemed like an apology from a distance, then straightened his jacket and moved away. Lucas bent to pick up the napkin bird. For a few seconds, nothing happened. That was the cruel part. Disaster did not always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it waited politely, long enough for people to decide they had imagined the danger. Caleb watched Lucas blink. The boy took one step toward the wall, then stopped. His hand returned to his chest, his lips parted. He seemed confused, almost embarrassed, as if his body had broken some rule at a fancy party. Then his knees softened. The glass of the ballroom doors caught Eleanor's reflection as she turned. And in that reflection, Caleb saw the moment a mother's face changed before she understood why. Lucas collapsed. At first, the room made the wrong sounds. A few startled laughs, a chair scraping, someone saying, "Careful," a server lowering a tray. Then Eleanor's voice cut through everything, sharp enough to tear the evening open. The crowd parted badly. Rich people were not used to moving quickly for anyone but themselves. They hesitated, stepped into each other's way, asked what happened, called for doctors, though half the people wearing hospital badges were already running. Caleb moved without deciding to move. He reached the edge of the crowd as Eleanor dropped to her knees beside her son. Lucas was on his side, breathing fast, eyes unfocused. His small hand clutched at his shirt. Eleanor kept saying his name, not loudly now, but with a terror so pure it made the air around her feel thin. A pediatric cardiologist who had been seated near the front pushed through. An emergency physician followed. Nurses appeared from the hall. Within seconds, Lucas was lifted onto a rolling stretcher and rushed toward the emergency suite adjoining the event wing. Eleanor ran beside them. The room stayed behind in stunned disorder. Music still played softly through the speakers because Caleb's sound system had not failed. The donation screen still glowed. A champagne glass lay tipped on its side beneath a table spreading a pale stain across the linen. Derek Shaw stood near the entrance, rubbing his cuff with his thumb. He looked toward the hallway, then toward the guests, then down at the paper napkin bird that had been crushed under someone's shoe. Caleb saw that too, but his mind had already gone somewhere else. He followed at a distance, stopping just outside the emergency area where staff were moving too fast for politeness. Through the glass, he could see Lucas transferred onto a bed. Monitors were attached. An oxygen mask went over the boy's face. A nurse cut open the small white shirt beneath the jacket. Eleanor stood near the wall with both hands over her mouth. The doctors were speaking quickly. Caleb could not hear every word through the glass, but he caught enough. Possible allergic reaction, food exposure, sudden collapse, airway, epinephrine, anaphylaxis. Someone asked about allergies. Eleanor, shaken nearly out of herself, said Lucas had reacted badly to shellfish once, that she was careful that she had told the caterers that she did not know. She did not know. Please, just help him. That was all the room needed to choose a path. Once a path is chosen in medicine, everything begins to move with frightening confidence. Caleb had seen it in war. He had seen it in hospitals. He had seen it in himself. The mind grabs the first explanation that fits enough of the facts, especially when seconds matter. Then every hand in the room starts serving that explanation. The team moved with skill. No one was lazy. No one was careless. No one wanted to harm a child. That made it worse. Because a mistake made by good people can still kill. Caleb stood behind the line where maintenance staff were supposed to stop. A security guard glanced at him once and then away, deciding he was not important. Through the glass, Caleb watched Lucas's chest rise unevenly. He watched the nurse check the skin. He watched a doctor listen at the throat and lungs. Then he saw the monitor. For a moment, the whole hallway seemed to narrow until there was only that green line. It was not just fast. It was wrong in a way that reached through Caleb's ribs and closed around an old part of him. The pattern carried a memory with it. A young soldier after a blast, another after a hard impact to the chest against the edge of a vehicle door. A rhythm that had looked almost reasonable until it suddenly was not. Electrical chaos wearing a thin mask. Caleb looked at Lucas again. No rash, no swelling in the face, no frantic scratching at the throat, no clear sign that the airway was closing the way the team's first assumption required. The boy had been hit in the chest. Hit hard. Caleb's mouth went dry. He told himself to leave. He was a maintenance electrician. His name was not on the surgical board. His license from the Navy did not give him authority inside a San Francisco emergency suite. There were specialists in that room who had studied longer than he had served. He could be wrong. He could humiliate himself. He could be fired. Worse, he could distract them at the exact moment focus mattered. He turned half away, and then he saw Grace. Not as a ghost. Caleb did not believe in that. He saw her the way grief makes the past stand inside the present, when the shape of the moment is too familiar to bear. He saw her lying in a bed trying to breathe. He saw himself standing beside her, swallowing words. He heard the sentence he had used to forgive his own fear before it became unforgivable. The doctors know what they are doing. Inside the room, Lucas's rhythm jumped. One of the nurses looked up sharply. Caleb stepped forward. The security guard put out a hand. Caleb barely looked at him. He moved past the man's arm and pushed through the emergency room door with enough force that it struck the wall. Every head turned. Caleb's voice came out rougher than he expected, but it carried. He said they were treating the wrong condition. For half a second, nobody moved. Then the room erupted. The emergency physician snapped at him to get out. A nurse reached for the call button. Security rushed in behind him, angry now, because invisible men were only tolerated while they stayed invisible. Eleanor turned toward Caleb with a face white from fear and disbelief. The chief physician in the room, Dr. Adrian Bell, straightened from the bedside. He was a tall man with silver hair, sharp eyes, and the exhausted authority of someone used to making decisions under pressure. He looked at Caleb's work shirt, then at the hospital badge on his belt. He asked who Caleb was. The question was not really a question. It was a warning. Caleb pointed at the monitor. He told them to look at the rhythm, at the repolarization changes, at the way the pattern had shifted after blunt impact to the chest. He said Lucas did not look like a straightforward anaphylaxis case. He said the collision near the entrance mattered. He said this could be commotio cordis, or a trauma-triggered electrical event, and if they kept pushing down the wrong road without checking, they could lose him. No one liked hearing that from a man with a tool pouch on his hip. One of the younger doctors said Caleb had no business making diagnoses. Another said they had a known allergy history. A third told security to remove him immediately. Security caught Caleb by both arms. He did not fight them. He did not need to. He raised his voice just enough to cut through the panic and said the thing that mattered most. The boy had been struck directly in the chest minutes before he collapsed. There was no visible airway swelling, no hives, no response pattern that should make them comfortable. Please check the cardiac pathway again before the window closed. The room did not become quiet all at once. It tightened. That was different. Dr. Bell looked from Caleb to the monitor, then to Lucas. Irritation still marked his face, but something more careful entered his eyes. Good doctors hate being challenged. The best ones hate being wrong more. Eleanor saw that hesitation and seized it like a rope. She demanded to know if Caleb could be right. No one answered quickly enough. That silence frightened her more than any answer could have. Dr. Bell ordered another look at the rhythm and called for the cardiac team to shift protocols. The room moved again, but the movement changed direction. A nurse adjusted medication orders. Another prepared equipment. Someone asked for details about the impact. Caleb, still held by security, gave them exactly what he had seen. The angle, the force, the timing. Lucas's hand to the chest, before and after the delay, before collapse. The next minutes were not dramatic in the way movies make them dramatic. They were worse. They were controlled panic. Numbers rose and dipped. Commands crossed the room. Eleanor stood frozen behind a nurse who kept gently moving her away from the bed. Lucas looked impossibly small beneath the equipment. Caleb watched the rhythm with the sick concentration of a man counting footsteps near a cliff. Then the new treatment began to work. Not beautifully, not instantly, but enough. The rhythm steadied by degrees. The wildness in the monitor lost some of its teeth. Lucas's breathing became less frantic. Color returned faintly to his face, like dawn deciding whether to enter a room. No one applauded. No one apologized. In emergency rooms, survival is too fragile for celebration at the first sign of mercy. But the entire room understood that something had shifted. Dr. Bell looked over his shoulder at Caleb, and for the first time, he did not look at the work shirt. He looked at the man inside it. Security loosened their grip. Eleanor moved toward Caleb, as if she wanted to ask him 100 things at once. But before she could speak, Dr. Bell told everyone Lucas was not out of danger. The immediate rhythm had been stabilized, but they needed imaging labs and a clearer understanding of what the blow had disturbed. The team wheeled Lucas toward a more advanced cardiac suite. Eleanor followed, then stopped and turned back to Caleb. There was gratitude in her face already, but it was buried beneath terror. Gratitude could wait. Her child could not. She asked Caleb how he knew. For a moment he almost gave the short answer. Military medicine, combat trauma, old training, something clean and practical that would keep the past sealed. Instead, he said, he had seen it before. That was all. Dr. Bell ordered a security officer to keep Caleb outside the restricted area. Not roughly, but firmly. The doctor had accepted the correction. He had not accepted Caleb as part of the team. Caleb understood. In a different life, he might have done the same. He stepped back into the hallway. The door closed. And just like that, he was outside again. Beyond the emergency wing, the gala had collapsed into whispers. Guests stood in anxious clusters beneath the soft lighting. Some were praying, some were texting. Some were already calculating what this meant for the event, the hospital the donor pledges the headlines. A few looked toward Caleb as he came down the hall, their expressions shifting from confusion to curiosity to discomfort. Derek Shaw was near a marble column, speaking quietly with a hospital administrator. When he saw Caleb, he looked away. Caleb should have gone home. His work order was complete. His shift was nearly over. He had already done the thing he had never done for Grace. He had spoken. Lucas had improved. That should have been enough. But his hands would not stop trembling. He walked to a staff alcove, leaned against the wall, and pressed the heels of his palms into his eyes. The body remembered afterward what the mind had postponed. His breath came unevenly. He heard the old helicopter thump in his skull. He smelled antiseptic and dust, and a trace of burnt cable from the sound panel. For a moment he was in too many rooms at once. The gala, the battlefield, Grace's hospital room, the apartment where Lily slept with her hallway light on, because both of them pretended it was for her. He took out his phone. There was a message from Lily's babysitter. All good. She beat me at checkers twice. Said to tell you she is not tired. Caleb stared at the message until the words steadied him. Then he typed back, "Tell her I am proud of her, and that tired people say they are not tired." The reply came with a laughing face. For the first time that night, Caleb almost smiled. Then the alarm sounded from the cardiac wing. It was not the public alarm that sent guests toward exits. It was smaller, sharper, meant for staff who understood its meaning. Caleb's body understood before his mind did. Lucas was crashing again. The hallway tightened with movement. A nurse ran past, then another. A respiratory therapist came fast from the elevator, carrying equipment. Eleanor's voice rose once behind the closed doors, raw and broken, and then disappeared under the rush of medical language. Caleb stepped toward the unit. The same security officer blocked him. This time, the guard did not look angry. He looked sorry. He said Caleb could not go in. Caleb nodded once. He did not push. He stood outside the line, listening to the muffled urgency beyond the doors, and every instinct in him strained against the rule keeping him in the hallway. Minutes passed. No one came out. Then Dr. Bell emerged briefly, speaking into a phone, his expression closed and severe. Caleb caught fragments. Recurrent instability. No clear lesion on standard imaging. Congenital possibility. Need another consult. Not enough time. Not enough time. Those words had a way of making every wall feel useless. Caleb moved before he could talk himself out of it. He approached a nurse he recognized from facilities repairs, a woman named Maria, who had once helped him restart a generator during a power transfer. She knew him as quiet, competent, and kind to tired staff. That gave him maybe 10 seconds of trust. He asked her to tell Eleanor Vance he needed to speak with her. Maria hesitated. Then another alarm note sounded behind the doors, and her face changed. She disappeared inside. Caleb waited. This waiting was different from the first one. The first time he had needed courage to interrupt. Now he needed courage to be dismissed. Because there was something else bothering him, something he had seen earlier but had not understood until Dr. Bell's words snapped it into place. Lucas rubbing his chest before the impact. The way he had paused after climbing the stage steps during rehearsal, pretending to admire the flowers while breathing through his mouth. The paper bird folded and unfolded by nervous fingers. The slight bluish shadow near his lips that Caleb had dismissed as ballroom lighting. Maybe the impact had not created the whole crisis. Maybe it had exposed one. During his years overseas, Caleb had learned to use small, portable ultrasound units in conditions no hospital would consider acceptable. Sometimes the standard view showed nothing. Sometimes dust, swelling position panic, or anatomy hid the thing that mattered. An instructor with a voice like gravel had once told him that machines were helpful, but angles saved lives. If the window was wrong, the truth could sit 1 inch away from the picture and remain invisible. There had been a boy once in a village clinic, not much older than Lucas, whose internal bleeding had been missed until Caleb tilted the probe under the ribs and found the dark pocket hiding behind the expected view. There had been a Marine whose pericardial fluid did not show cleanly until they rolled him just enough to open a narrow window beneath the sternum. Caleb remembered the pressure of the probe, the bad lighting, the sweat under his gloves, the terrible relief of finally seeing what had almost been missed. He was not a doctor. He was not pretending to be one, but he knew hidden things could kill, while experts looked straight at them from the wrong direction. Eleanor came out of the cardiac suite as if she had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Her hair, perfect an hour earlier, had come loose near one temple. Her lipstick was gone. Her eyes were fixed on Caleb with the intense hope of someone who had discovered that rules were less important than breath. She asked what he knew. Caleb told her he did not know. That honesty struck her harder than any confident claim might have. He said he had seen enough to be afraid there was a small structural problem they had not caught. He told her Lucas had shown subtle signs before the impact. He explained that in the field, standard views sometimes missed what a different angle could reveal. He suggested that the team repeat the scan with a low subcostal and off-axis sweep, focusing near the outflow tract and coronary flow, not because it would definitely show the answer, but because if it did, they might still have time. Eleanor listened as if each word were a handhold. Behind her, Dr. Bell stepped into the hall and heard the last part. His face hardened again. This time, the resistance in him was not pride alone. It was fear. Caleb could see it. The doctor was carrying a child's life in a room full of incomplete information, and now a maintenance worker was asking him to spend precious minutes on an angle outside the immediate plan. Dr. Bell said they had already performed imaging. Caleb said he understood. Dr. Bell said the specialists were reviewing. Caleb said he understood that too. The doctor finally snapped and asked if Caleb understood what it meant to offer suggestions without responsibility for the outcome. That landed. For a second, Caleb had no answer, because he did understand. More than the doctor knew. He looked through the glass at the blur of movement around Lucas. Then he looked at Eleanor, whose world had shrunk to one bed, one child, one chance. Caleb's voice changed when he spoke again. It lost the sharpness of argument. It became quieter, and somehow the hallway quieted with it. He told them his wife had died 3 years earlier, after he noticed signs that did not match the first diagnosis. He told them he had been afraid to challenge people with titles. He had been afraid to be wrong, afraid to sound arrogant, afraid to be the grieving husband who thought his old training made him smarter than specialists. So he said nothing. He did not describe Grace's final breath. He did not have to. The cost of it was already in his face. He said he was not asking them to believe him because he wanted to be right. He was asking because once in his life he had chosen silence, and silence had followed him home every day since. Then he said, as plainly as he could, that if there was even a small chance another angle could show what the standard scan missed, Lucas deserved that chance. Eleanor turned to Dr. Bell. The doctor began to speak, stopped, and looked back toward the room. Hospitals are full of hierarchies, departments, credentials, committees, chains of command. Most exist for good reasons. Chaos can be deadly. But there are moments when hierarchy becomes a locked door, and the truth is standing on the wrong side wearing a work shirt. Eleanor Vance had spent her entire adult life opening locked doors, with money pressure, intelligence, and will. But this door was different. This one had her son behind it. She told Dr. Bell to repeat the scan. He said there were risks in delaying. She said there was a risk in not looking. No one in the hallway mistook her voice for a request. The team moved again. Caleb was not allowed inside. He watched through the glass while the imaging specialist adjusted the probe. Dr. Bell stood close, arms folded, jaw tight. Another cardiologist, summoned from upstairs, leaned over the screen. The first view showed what they had already seen, nothing obvious enough to explain the instability. A few people in the room looked toward the hall, as if that settled it. Caleb did not move. The specialist shifted, then shifted again. The probe angled beneath the rib line deeper, less comfortable, searching through the narrow acoustic window Caleb had described. The screen flickered with gray shapes that would have meant nothing to most of the donors, still whispering under chandeliers. To Caleb, the image was not clean, but he could see the room change before he understood what the screen showed. The specialist's shoulders lifted. Dr. Bell leaned closer. The second cardiologist pointed at something and said one word Caleb could not hear. Then another. Flow. Obstruction. Congenital. Eleanor saw the doctors' faces and nearly folded where she stood. What they found was small enough to have hidden for years and dangerous enough to decide a life in minutes. Lucas had a rare congenital abnormality near the heart's outflow and coronary circulation, the kind that could sit quietly beneath ordinary childhood until stress, exertion, or trauma turned it cruel. The blow to his chest had not merely startled his heart into a bad rhythm, it had pushed an already vulnerable system into crisis. The earlier assumption had been understandable. The missed detail had almost been fatal. Once they knew where to look, everything changed. The cardiac team moved Lucas toward an emergency procedure suite. Calls went out. Consent forms appeared. Eleanor's hand shook so badly she could barely hold the pen, so a nurse guided the paper beneath her fingers. The hospital's best people came running, but now they were running toward the right enemy. Caleb stayed in the hallway. No one asked him to leave this time. He stood near the wall with his hands clasped in front of him, because if he let them hang loose, everyone would see them shaking. Across from him, Eleanor sat in a chair that looked too small for the woman the world believed her to be. Maria, the nurse, brought her water. Eleanor did not drink it. The gala beyond the corridor had become a distant, embarrassed murmur. Some guests had gone home. Others remained because tragedy near wealth becomes a kind of magnet. Hospital staff moved between them with professional faces. The donation screen had been turned off. The banners still hung over the stage. One more heartbeat, suddenly stripped of ceremony. Derek Shaw approached, once stopping several yards from Eleanor. He said her name gently, as if softness could make him innocent. Eleanor looked up. Derek told her it had all happened so fast. He said Lucas had stepped into him. He said children were unpredictable in crowds. He said he hoped no one was turning a terrible accident into blame. Caleb watched Eleanor's eyes. Something in them hardened, not because she had room for anger yet, but because truth has a sound. Derek's version did not have it. Before Eleanor could answer, a security supervisor came down the hall holding a tablet. His face was pale. He had reviewed the entrance footage at Dr. Bell's request, trying to establish the timeline of the impact. The video showed Derek turning blindly through the doorway, with his shoulder lowered and his phone in his hand. It showed Lucas standing still. It showed the force of the collision. It showed Derek looking around afterward, not first at the child, but at the witnesses. Derek's mouth opened. No sentence came out clean. He began to talk about lawyers. Eleanor stood then. She was smaller than Derek, but in that hallway he seemed to shrink beneath her grief. She told him that if her son survived, the first thing Lucas would hear from her was that the man who hurt him mattered less than the people who helped him. Then she told security to escort Derek out of the hospital. Derek protested. He mentioned his donation. He mentioned the board. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She said his donation would be returned. That was the first piece of justice that night, small but clean. It did not save Lucas. It did not heal Caleb. It did not undo anything. But it removed one lie from the hallway, and sometimes, in a crisis, one lie removed is enough to let people breathe. After Derek was gone, Eleanor sat again. For a long while, she and Caleb said nothing. Then she asked his wife's name. Caleb looked at the floor. He said, "Grace." Eleanor repeated it softly, not as a question, but as a form of respect. The hallway clock clicked through another minute. Eleanor said Lucas used to ask why she worked so much. She had always told him she was building things that would help people. Better systems, better access, better tools for hospitals. She believed it when she said it. Most of the time it was true. But lately she admitted the work had become so large that she sometimes missed the small things right in front of her. She said Lucas had complained of feeling tired twice that month. Caleb did not look at her sharply. He did not let accusation enter his face. Parents already have enough knives waiting for them when fear comes. He said, "Children hide discomfort when they think adults are busy." Eleanor closed her eyes. It was the kindest answer, and somehow the hardest. The procedure took longer than anyone wanted and less time than the surgeons feared. Time in a hospital hallway is not normal time. It gathers weight. 10 minutes can feel like an accusation. An hour can feel like a country you have been exiled into. Eleanor stood, sat, paced, prayed, without moving her lips, and stared at doors as if love could force them open. Caleb thought of Lily, asleep at home, one arm probably hanging off the bed, her hair stuck to her cheek. He thought of Grace, teaching her to tie shoes, Grace laughing because Lily made 2 loops and called them bunny ears with hats. He thought of all the future moments that had been cut away from their lives so cleanly, the world expected him to keep walking as if he were still whole. He had believed for 3 years that speaking now could not matter because he had failed then. That night, waiting for Lucas, he began to understand that grief had lied to him. Nothing could give Grace back. But that did not mean every door after her death had to remain closed. At last, the procedure room doors opened. Dr. Bell came out first. No one needed him to speak quickly. His face had already changed. He told Eleanor that Lucas was alive, stabilized, still critical, still facing recovery and further treatment, but past the immediate crisis. The team had corrected the obstruction enough to restore safer flow and calm the rhythm. They would monitor him closely. They would bring in pediatric cardiac specialists through the night. There would be more answers in the morning. But Lucas had made it through. Eleanor made a sound Caleb had heard from soldiers, parents, spouses, and strangers. A sound from the place where the body has held fear too long and suddenly does not know where to put it. She covered her face and wept. No one in that hallway saw a billionaire then. They saw a mother whose child had been returned to her by inches. Dr. Bell stood quietly until she lowered her hands. Then, with visible effort, he turned to Caleb. The apology did not come in polished language. That made it better. He said Caleb had been right to speak. He said they should have widened a differential sooner after hearing about the chest impact. He said the second imaging angle had changed the outcome. Then he asked where Caleb had trained. Caleb gave the short version this time. Navy corpsmen, rescue teams, too many bad rooms. Dr. Bell nodded, as if each word rearranged something he should have understood earlier. He did not call Caleb a hero. Caleb was grateful for that. Hero is a word people sometimes use when they do not want to look too closely at what courage costs. Eleanor went in to see Lucas. Caleb stayed behind the glass. He saw only part of the room, the edge of the bed, a small hand beneath a blanket, Eleanor bending over it with both shoulders shaking. He saw her touch her son's hair with a care so gentle It seemed to ask permission from the air. Lucas did not wake fully, but his fingers moved against hers. Eleanor bowed her head. Caleb turned away before the moment became something he was intruding on. He walked back toward the ballroom to gather his tools. The room looked strange now. Not empty exactly, but exposed. Without music and speeches, the flowers seemed too arranged, the table settings too bright, the untouched desserts almost indecent. Staff were clearing glasses. A few donors lingered in corners, speaking in low voices with the serious expressions people wear when they want to appear affected by something without being changed by it. Caleb found his cable spool behind the curtain. The soundboard lights glowed steady. He almost laughed at that, though there was nothing funny in it. He had been hired to prevent an interruption in the gala. Instead, the most important thing he did all night was interrupt. As he knelt to latch his toolbox, he found Lucas's papered napkin bird near the base of the curtain. It had been stepped on. One wing was crushed. The fold down the center was torn halfway through. Caleb picked it up carefully, smoothing it with his thumb. He did not know why he kept it. Maybe because broken things had always called to his hands. An hour later, Eleanor found him near the service elevator. She had washed her face, but her eyes were red. Without the performance of the gala around her, she looked less distant, more human, and far more tired. Dr. Bell stood a few steps behind her. Maria was there too. So was the hospital director, a man who had spent most of the night looking as if the floor had become unstable beneath his polished shoes. Eleanor thanked Caleb. He said she did not need to. She said she did. Then she asked the question everyone expected from a woman who could buy almost anything. She asked what he wanted. The hospital director looked relieved by the question. Money was a language he understood. A settlement, a reward, a promotion, a scholarship for Caleb's daughter, a house, a public honor, a consulting title. All of it could be arranged. All of it would make the story easier to package. Caleb looked down at the crushed paper bird in his hand. For a moment, he thought of practical things. He thought of rent. He thought of Lily's school shoes, the ones that were getting tight. He thought of the dental bill folded under a magnet on his refrigerator. He thought of how tired he was of pretending not to count every dollar twice. Then he thought of Grace. He thought of the question that had followed him for 3 years. What if I had spoken? And he realized that money could make his life easier, but it could not answer that question for anyone else. So he told Eleanor he did not want a reward. He wanted a change. He said the hospital had almost lost Lucas because the first explanation became too powerful too quickly. He said no system should depend on whether one grieving maintenance worker happened to be standing near the right glass door at the right time. He wanted a protocol that made room for doubt before pride. A way for nurses, technicians, aides, paramedics, maintenance workers, parents, and anyone close enough to see a crucial detail to be heard without being punished for speaking. The hospital director shifted uncomfortably. Caleb did not stop. He said young doctors should be trained not only to make decisions, but to notice when the room had narrowed too soon. Pediatric cardiac screening should be strengthened for children with faint symptoms that busy adults might miss. Emergency teams should have a formal pause after sudden collapse when the signs did not match the first diagnosis. Imaging training should include the unusual views that field medicine sometimes learned the hard way. He looked at Dr. Bell. Then, not accusingly, he said expertise was not the problem. Closed doors were. Dr. Bell took that quietly. Eleanor did too. The hospital director began to explain that institutional change required committees, review periods, legal considerations, and coordination across departments. Eleanor turned her head toward him. He stopped speaking. She said they would begin in the morning. Not someday. Morning. That was the second piece of justice. The first had removed a lie. The second opened a door. Lucas spent the next week in pediatric cardiac care. His recovery was not a montage. It was tubes, tests, careful medication, specialist meetings, fear returning in smaller waves, and Eleanor learning the grammar of hospital waiting. Some days brought good news. Other days brought new questions. There were moments when Lucas was brave, because children often are, and moments when he cried because being brave had made him tired. When he was finally awake enough to understand pieces of what had happened, Eleanor told him that many people had helped save him. Lucas asked if that included the man who fixed the microphone. Eleanor smiled through tears and said yes, especially him. Caleb did not visit at first. He told himself it was better that way. The family needed privacy. The doctors needed space. He had work orders stacked across 3 buildings because emergencies do not stop lights from burning out or elevators from complaining. He returned to the maintenance shop where someone had taped a handwritten note to his locker that said, "Nice job, Reed." No one mentioned it loudly. That suited him. But word moved through the hospital anyway. By Tuesday, the cafeteria cashier refused to charge him for coffee. By Wednesday, a nurse from pediatrics hugged him without warning and then apologized into his shoulder. By Thursday, one of the residents who had argued against him in the emergency room found him repairing a faulty outlet near radiology and stood there awkwardly until Caleb looked up. The resident said he had been wrong. Caleb said they had all been scared. The resident seemed almost disappointed not to be punished. Caleb understood that too. Guilt wants a sentence. Mercy asks for work. So Caleb told him to remember the feeling not as shame, but as a warning light. When the room gets too certain, too fast, check the corners. The resident nodded and wrote that down on the back of a folded patient list. On Friday, Eleanor asked Caleb to come to Lucas's room. He almost said no. Then he thought of Lily and of the way children make adults braver by needing the world to be less broken than it is. Lucas was propped up in bed with wires still attached to him and a stack of cards on the tray table. He looked smaller than he had at the gala, but more himself. His hair stuck up in one place. A stuffed dinosaur rested against his hip. The paper napkin bird Caleb had saved was on the windowsill, repaired clumsily with clear tape. Eleanor must have found it among his things. Lucas looked at Caleb with solemn curiosity. He asked if Caleb was really a soldier. Caleb said he used to be a medic. Lucas asked if that meant he fixed people. Caleb glanced at Eleanor. Her eyes shone, but she let him answer. He said he tried to help until someone smarter could take over. Lucas considered that, then said his mom told him Caleb helped because he noticed his heart was making the wrong shape. That was not technically precise. It was completely true. Caleb smiled for real then, small but unforced. He said Lucas's heart had been trying to tell the grown-ups something, and he was glad they listened in time. Lucas touched the tape on the paper bird. He said Caleb could keep it if he wanted. Caleb told him it belonged to him. Lucas shook his head with the exhausted seriousness of a child recovering from fear. He said Caleb had fixed it. Eleanor covered her mouth and turned toward the window. Caleb took the bird, because refusing would have made the gift smaller than it was. He placed it carefully in his shirt pocket, the same pocket that held wire caps, pencil stubs, and work orders on ordinary days. After that change came slowly, then all at once. Eleanor Vance did not merely write another check. That would have been easy, and easy things no longer satisfied her. She funded an independent review of the emergency response, including the first incorrect assumption, the hierarchy that nearly kept Caleb outside, and the communication gaps that made a critical eyewitness detail feel unofficial until it was almost too late. The report was not flattering. To the hospital's credit and Eleanor's pressure, it was not buried. Sterling Medical Center launched a new pediatric cardiac vigilance program within months. Children with unexplained fainting chest discomfort, exercise intolerance, or odd episodes after impact were routed into deeper screening. Emergency teams were trained to perform a brief diagnostic reset when symptoms did not match the first working theory. Simulation labs included cases where the life-saving clue came from a parent, a paramedic, a technician, or someone with no impressive title at all. The unusual ultrasound approaches Caleb had described were not romanticized as battlefield magic. They were studied, tested, refined, and taught properly by qualified specialists. Caleb insisted on that. He wanted no one copying a story. He wanted them learning a principle. Sometimes the standard view is not the whole truth. Dr. Bell helped build the training. That surprised people. It did not surprise Caleb. Pride had nearly hurt Lucas, but Dr. Bell was not a villain. He was a skilled man who had been forced to see the edge of his own certainty. Some people, when shown that edge, step back and pretend they never saw it. Dr. Bell did not. He stood in front of young physicians and told them about the night a maintenance electrician interrupted him and saved his patient from his assumptions. He used Caleb's name. Caleb asked him not to make it heroic. Dr. Bell said the point was not heroism, the point was humility. That answer Caleb accepted. Eleanor also changed the gala. The following year there were still donors' gowns and speeches. Money still mattered because medicine, for all its compassion, runs on expensive machines, paid staff, research beds, and time. But the event no longer opened with billionaires congratulating one another. It opened with the voices of nurses, transport workers, respiratory therapists, maintenance staff, paramedics, parents, and former patients. On every table sat a small folded paper bird. No one explained it at first. Then Eleanor stepped onto the stage, not as smoothly as the year before. Her voice caught when she looked toward the front row, where Lucas sat, with a faint scar, a brighter color in his face, and pancakes listed in the program as the official dessert for the children's ward the next morning. She told the room that the most important truth her family learned had not come from the loudest voice, the richest donor, or the highest title. It came from someone almost everyone had been trained not to see. Caleb stood at the back of the room in a clean shirt Lily had insisted he iron twice. He had refused a seat at the front. He regretted that decision as soon as Eleanor began talking, because now everyone turned around to look at him. Lily, standing beside him in a blue dress and scuffed flats, slipped her hand into his. She was 8, the same age as Lucas, old enough to understand pieces of the story and young enough to ask the parts adults avoided. She whispered that Mom would be proud. Caleb looked down at her. For 3 years he had tried to keep Grace alive for Lily through photographs, stories, recipes, and bedtime memories. He had told Lily her mother was kind, funny, stubborn in the best way. He had told her Grace could turn rainy mornings into blanket forts and cheap soup into a feast. He had not told her the part where he failed to speak. Some truths are too heavy for children until they grow strong enough to carry them with you. But Lily had always known there was a locked room in her father's heart. That night, something in it opened, not all the way. Healing rarely throws open every window at once, but enough for air. When Eleanor called Caleb forward, he almost stayed where he was. Then Lily squeezed his hand and walked with him. The crowd rose, but Caleb barely heard the applause. He was looking at Lucas, who was clapping, carefully grinning with the shy pride of a child who knew a secret about survival. Eleanor offered Caleb a plaque. He accepted because ceremonies mattered to other people, and sometimes kindness meant letting them give. But when he reached the microphone, he did not tell the room a polished story. He spoke briefly. He said, "The doctors saved Lucas. The nurses saved Lucas. The people who built the machines, cleaned the rooms, checked the alarms, carried the blood, answered the phones, and noticed what did not fit. All had a part in saving people every day." He said the lesson of that night should not be that one man was brave. The lesson should be that a room becomes safer when truth is allowed to enter through any door. Then he looked down at Lily. He said, "Some people live with a silence they wish they could take back." The room grew very still. He said, "If you are ever the person who sees something wrong and fear tells you to stay quiet because you are not important enough, remember that fear may not be the voice worth obeying." That was all. He stepped back before the applause could turn him into something simpler than a man. The program that began after Lucas's collapse eventually took Grace's name in a way Caleb had not expected. Eleanor asked first. She did not assume grief could be purchased. She came to Caleb's maintenance office one afternoon with no cameras, no assistants, and no speech prepared. She said she wanted to fund a communication and diagnostic training initiative called the Grace Reed Listening Protocol, but only if Caleb and Lily felt it honored her rather than used her. Caleb took the proposal home. He and Lily sat at the kitchen table after dinner, the folder between them. Lily read the first page slowly, sounding out some of the longer words. When she reached her mother's name, she touched it with one finger. She asked if it meant doctors would listen better. Caleb said that was the hope. Lily asked if Mom would like that. Caleb looked toward the refrigerator, where Grace's old recipe card for lemon chicken was still held up by a magnet shaped like a sunflower. The card had a stain in one corner and a note in Grace's handwriting that said, "More garlic than Caleb thinks." For the first time in a long time, remembering her did not only hurt. He told Lily yes. He thought her mom would like that very much. So the program carried Grace's name, not because Caleb needed the world to know his pain, but because pain, when given work to do, can sometimes become shelter for someone else. Within a year, Sterling's pediatric unit changed in ways both large and small. A red-bordered question appeared on emergency intake screens. What did someone nearby see before the collapse? Parents were asked not only what their child ate, but what happened in the minutes before symptoms began. Staff were trained to repeat observations back instead of filtering them through assumptions too quickly. Maintenance teams and transport staff received clear instructions on how to report clinical concerns without crossing into roles they did not hold. Residents practiced saying, "I may be wrong, let's look again," until the words felt less like weakness and more like skill. There were still mistakes. There always would be. Medicine is human because humans practice it. Machines help. Protocols help. Titles help. But none of them remove fear, fatigue, pressure, ego, grief, or the dangerous comfort of being almost certain. The goal was never perfection. The goal was to make silence harder to choose. Caleb stayed in maintenance. That confused people. Offers came. Consultant roles, paid speaking invitations, a television interview that wanted him in dramatic lighting with folded arms. A veterans group asked him to tell the story on a national stage. A medical device company sent a glossy proposal with words like brand partnership and human insight. Caleb declined almost all of it. He did speak to trainees at Sterling 4 times a year because Dr. Bell asked and because those rooms mattered. But he kept his job. He liked fixing things that had clear problems. A breaker tripped, a wire shorted, a pump failed, a light flickered. Not everything in life offered that mercy. Some mornings he passed the pediatric wing and saw the new wall display outside the cardiac unit. It listed donors, surgeons, nurses, and program leaders. Near the bottom, beneath a small paper bird etched into the glass, were the words, "For every voice that sees what others miss." Caleb never stopped when people were nearby. But sometimes, early in the morning, before the hall filled, he stood in front of it for a few seconds and let himself breathe. Lucas recovered well. Not perfectly, not magically, but well. He had follow-up surgeries and restrictions that frustrated him. He learned more about his own heart than any 8-year-old should have to know. He complained about medication. He got tired of adults asking how he felt. He discovered that hospital pancakes were not as good as promised, then negotiated with Eleanor until the kitchen changed the recipe. That small victory made him famous among the children on the ward. He and Lily became friends in the strange way children do when adults have shared too much fear around them. They did not talk about death or courage. They traded stickers, argued about card games, and once built a paper bird army along a windowsill, while Eleanor and Caleb spoke quietly in the hall. Eleanor never became an entirely different person. People rarely do. She was still direct, demanding, impatient with excuses, and capable of making board members sit straighter with a single look. But the direction of her force changed. She paid attention to who was missing from rooms. She asked nurses what administrators had stopped hearing. She walked through service corridors without making a performance of it. She learned the names of people who kept the hospital breathing between donor tours. When a new wing was proposed, with an expensive glass donor lounge but cramped family sleep areas, she killed the first design in 9 minutes. When a department head complained that the new listening protocol slowed decisions, she asked for the data. The data showed that most pauses took less than a minute, and several had already caught important missed details. The complaint disappeared. When Derek Shaw tried months later to return through another charity board, Eleanor made sure the footage and the hospital report followed him. Not to destroy him for an accident, but to stop him from turning denial into reputation. He eventually issued a public apology written by someone expensive. The apology mattered less than the quiet fact that his name no longer appeared on the pediatric donor wall. Caleb had no interest in Derek. That surprised Lily, who asked one night if he hated the man who bumped into Lucas. Caleb thought about it while drying a plate. He said hate was heavy, and they already had enough to carry. Lily asked if that meant Derek should just get away with it. Caleb said no. Consequences were not the same as hate. Consequences were how people learned the world did not bend around their excuses. Lily accepted that with a child's seriousness, then asked if consequences applied to unfinished homework. Caleb said, absolutely. She said that was different. For a moment, the apartment filled with ordinary laughter. That was healing too. 3 years after Grace's death, Caleb had believed his life had narrowed permanently around one failure. He had believed the best he could do was raise Lily, avoid trouble, keep machines running, and carry his regret quietly enough that it did not spill onto anyone else. But the night of the gala had taught him something he had not expected. Regret can become a prison if all it does is repeat the past. But regret can also become a warning, a hand on the shoulder, a voice that says, not this time. He still missed Grace. That did not change. There was no program, no applause, no saved child, no public honor that could replace the sound of her keys in the door or the way she hummed when she was concentrating. Some evenings, grief still entered without knocking. It sat beside him while Lily did homework. It followed him through grocery aisles. It appeared when he found one of Grace's old sweaters in the back of a closet and had to sit on the floor for a while before he could stand again. But grief was no longer only accusation. Sometimes it felt like love with nowhere easy to go. And now, because of Lucas, because of Eleanor, because of one terrible night beneath chandeliers, some of that love had somewhere to go. One late afternoon, Caleb was repairing a light outside the pediatric cardiac wing when he heard a familiar voice below him. Lucas stood in the hallway wearing a backpack nearly as large as his torso. Eleanor was beside him holding a folder of follow-up papers. Lucas looked stronger now, still slender, still careful when he moved too fast, but alive in the impatient way of children who have decided recovery is taking too long. He asked Caleb if the light was broken. Caleb, standing on the ladder, said it was just tired. Lucas said hearts could be tired too. Caleb climbed down slowly. He said that was true. Lucas looked toward the glass wall with a paper bird etched into it. Then he reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded napkin. Not the original, which Caleb still kept at home in a small box with Grace's recipe card and Lily's first lost tooth, but a new one. This bird was neater, stronger, folded with the confidence of practice. Lucas handed it to Caleb and said it was for people who looked from different angles. Eleanor turned away, pretending to study the donor wall. Caleb held the paper bird in both hands. He said it was the best kind of engineering. Lucas beamed. That night, Caleb brought the bird home. Lily placed it on the kitchen shelf beside a school photo of Grace. The paper looked too simple to carry what it carried, but most important things do. After Lily went to bed, Caleb sat alone at the kitchen table. The apartment was quiet, except for the refrigerator hum and the distant city traffic. He opened the small box where he kept the first crushed bird, the one from the gala. Its tape had yellowed slightly, one wing still bent unevenly. He placed the new bird beside it. For a long while he looked at them together, one damaged, one steady, both still able to hold their shape. Then he took out a sheet of paper and began writing a letter to Grace. He had not done that since the first month after she died. Back then, every letter had been desperate, filled with questions that had no mercy in them. Why did this happen? Why did I freeze? How am I supposed to raise our daughter without you? He had stopped because the pages only seemed to deepen the wound. This letter was different. He told her about Lucas, about Eleanor, about the emergency room doors, about how afraid he had been, about how close he came to turning away again. He told her he was sorry, not for loving her badly, because he had loved her with everything he knew how to give. Not for failing to be God, because no human being gets that job, no matter how much guilt demands it. He was sorry for letting fear decide what his voice was worth when she needed every voice in the room. Then he wrote something his hand resisted at first. I spoke this time. He stared at the sentence. It did not erase the one before it. It did not make the past gentle, but it was true. And truth, even when it arrives late, can become a place to stand. In the months that followed, Caleb slept a little better. Not every night. Healing did not move in a straight line, and some memories still had sharp edges. But the question that had haunted him began to change. What if I had spoken? It did not disappear. But beside it, another question grew. Who might live if I speak now? That question did not punish him. It called him forward. The story of Sterling Medical Center eventually spread far beyond San Francisco. Some versions became too polished. Some made Caleb sound like a lone genius who defeated arrogant doctors. Some made Eleanor sound like a cold billionaire saved by a humble worker. Some turned Lucas into a symbol before he had finished being a child. The truest version was quieter. A boy was hit in the chest. A room full of skilled people moved fast in the wrong direction. A maintenance worker saw what did not fit. A mother chose to listen. A doctor chose to look again. A system shaken by how close it came to tragedy changed because one saved life was not enough if the same silence could endanger another. That is the version Caleb carried. Not because it made him look best, but because it gave responsibility to everyone who had touched the night. Lucas lived because Caleb spoke yes. But he also lived because Dr. Bell stopped long enough to reconsider. Because Maria carried a message through a door. Because Eleanor used power for something more urgent than pride. Because nurses kept working while fear filled the room. Because a second scan was done. Because afterward, people did not let the story become applause and then fade. Courage opened the door. Humility kept it open. One evening, nearly a year after the gala, Caleb and Lily walked past Sterling on their way to a small diner Grace had loved. The hospital windows glowed above them. Through the glass lobby, they could see workers setting up for another event, smaller this time. No chandeliers, no red carpet, just folding chairs, coffee urns, and a banner for a training conference on pediatric emergency listening. Lily stopped on the sidewalk. She asked if he ever wished he had a bigger job now. Caleb looked through the glass at a young maintenance worker testing a microphone, tapping it twice, then smiling when the sound came through clean. He thought about titles, uniforms, badges, and the strange ways people decide who matters. Then he looked at his daughter. He said fixing things was still a pretty big job. Lily considered that. Then she took his hand and said, Mom would say he was being humble in an annoying way. Caleb laughed hard enough that people walking by turned to look. For once, he did not mind being seen. They ate pancakes for dinner because Lucas had made them both believe pancakes were appropriate at any hour. Lily spilled syrup on her sleeve. Caleb told her Grace would have called that a tax paid to the breakfast gods, then immediately regretted the phrase because Lily repeated it too loudly to the waitress. They laughed again, and the laughter did not feel like betrayal. It felt like life continuing. Later, after Lily fell asleep, Caleb stood in her doorway and watched her breathe. Parents do this for reasons children do not understand until much later. He thought of Eleanor doing the same beside Lucas's hospital bed. He thought of all the parents in rooms across the city, listening to monitors, footsteps, coughs, tiny changes in breath. He thought of the staff moving through those rooms, tired and human, trying to catch what mattered. He whispered goodnight to Lily. Then he walked to the kitchen where the two paper birds sat on the shelf, the damaged one and the steady one. He touched the edge of the older bird gently. For 3 years he had believed courage meant being unafraid, and because he was afraid, he had thought the brave part of his life was behind him. The battlefield, the uniform, the rescues other people understood. But that was not what courage had turned out to be. Courage was walking toward a door when every rule told him to stay out. Courage was letting people look down on him long enough to say what a dying child needed said. Courage was admitting pain without using it as a weapon. Courage was asking a powerful room to become humble. And sometimes, courage was quieter than all of that. Sometimes it was a father standing in a small apartment, choosing not to let the worst day of his life have the last word. The value of a person is not measured by the suit they wear, the title printed on their badge, the degrees framed on their wall, or the table where they are invited to sit. It is measured in the moment when silence would be easier. Caleb Reed was invisible to almost everyone at that gala. He was the maintenance man behind the curtain, the worker with old boots, the person people expected to fix the sound and disappear. But when a child's life narrowed to seconds, he became the one person willing to risk humiliation for the truth. That does not make titles worthless. It makes humility essential, because the truth does not always enter the room wearing authority. Sometimes it comes from the corner, from the hallway, from the parent everyone thinks is panicking, from the nurse who has seen one detail too many, from the technician who notices a number out of place, from the quiet worker whose hands remember a kind of emergency nobody asked about. The question is whether the room is wise enough to listen. So if you were Caleb, standing outside that emergency room while the experts moved in the wrong direction, would you have spoken? Would you have risked your job, your dignity, and the judgment of everyone in the room for the chance that a child might live? Share your answer in the comments. And if you believe ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to stay silent, like this story, subscribe to the channel and pass it on to someone who needs a reminder that courage can come from the most overlooked place in the room.
You are suspended. Step away from that patient. There are 40 people coming, and this room is already behind.
We'll handle it. Focus on the immediate.
You have no authorization here.
Red goes now. Yellow waits with eyes on them. Green stays out of ambulance flow.
Priya, start the medication board. Nothing leaves your hand unwritten. Captain Miller? Save your breath. Let them work.
I'm sorry, Nurse Miller.
The first thing Sarah Miller heard after they suspended her was not the closing of the hospital door behind her. It was the sound of sirens. Not one ambulance. Not the ordinary city wail that came and went so many times a day that most people inside Chicago General barely noticed it anymore. This was different. This was layered, urgent, uneven, coming from more than one direction at once. It rolled through the winter air like a warning. Sarah was standing outside the emergency entrance with a cardboard box pressed against her coat. Inside it were 15 years of a life she had given to that hospital. A spare pair of shoes, a cracked travel mug, a folded sweater, a stack of thank you cards from patients she had never thrown away. A small metal whistle on a faded orange cord tucked under everything else where almost nobody would see it. The security guard beside her looked uncomfortable. He was young, barely old enough to remember a hospital before electronic charts and automatic doors. He had been told to escort her out, and he had done it gently, as if politeness could soften the insult. Sarah did not blame him. She had seen enough uniforms in her life to know that some people only carried orders. Others decided what those orders were worth. Snow moved sideways across the parking lot, the kind of fine needling snow that did not look dangerous from a window, but on open roads could turn visibility into a rumor. Sarah looked across the lanes of idling cars, past the gray piles of plowed slush, toward the ambulance bay. The first ambulance came in too fast. Then a second. Then a third turned hard enough that its tires scraped against the curb. For a moment, nobody seemed to understand what was happening. The automatic doors opened and closed. A paramedic jumped down before the vehicle had fully stopped. Another shouted for trauma teams. A stretcher rolled out with a man strapped down, his face gray, his lips moving around words nobody could hear. Sarah stood still. She had just been told she no longer had the right to step through those doors as a nurse. Her badge had been taken. Her access had been turned off. Her name, which had been on the emergency department schedule since before some of the new residents were in college, had been removed with one administrative click. And yet, her body moved before her pride could stop it. Because the thing about people who have spent their lives near death is that they do not hear sirens the way everyone else does. They hear time running out. 2 hours earlier, Sarah had still been Nurse Miller, senior emergency nurse, night shift veteran, the quiet one, who noticed what other people missed. Among the staff, she had a reputation for being serious, not cold exactly, just controlled. She did not join every break room argument. She did not decorate her locker with jokes. She rarely talked about herself. When younger nurses asked how she stayed calm through chest pain, seizures, overdoses, grief, and family members screaming prayers into fluorescent light, Sarah usually gave the same small answer. You do what is in front of you. It sounded simple. It was not. For 15 years, Sarah had worked in the emergency department at Chicago General Hospital, a place that never really slept. At 3 in the morning, when the rest of the city narrowed into dark apartment windows and salted roads, the ER still glowed. It took in the confused, the injured, the frightened, the addicted, the lonely, the unlucky. The people who had put off pain for too long, and the people whose lives had been interrupted in a single, brutal second. Sarah knew that department the way some people knew their own kitchens. She knew which medication drawers stuck when the room was cold. She knew which monitor cable failed if it was twisted too tightly. She knew which resident looked confident while panicking, and which janitor would find an extra blanket faster than any supply cart. She knew how a mother sounded when she was angry because she was terrified. She knew the silence that sometimes fell over a patient just before the body gave up pretending it was stable. What most people did not know was where she had learned to trust that silence. Before Chicago General, before the name tag, before the blue scrubs and the sensible shoes, Sarah Miller had spent 5 years in the United States Coast Guard. She had served on rescue crews along Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes region, where weather could turn mean with almost no warning. Out there, danger did not wait for committees. It arrived in black water, white spray, snapped lines, numb hands, and voices on the radio that went thin with fear. She had learned to read a storm by the behavior of birds and waves. She had learned to hear panic under a calm voice. She had learned that a person could be talking 1 minute and gone the next if somebody with training failed to act. On paper, those years were a short chapter in her past. Inside Sarah, they had never ended. They had become the part of her that counted exits in crowded rooms, the part that noticed when someone was too still, the part that did not relax just because the machines looked normal. That winter morning, the patient who changed everything was a man named Daniel Whitaker. He was 58, a school maintenance supervisor brought in after slipping on an icy sidewalk outside a bus stop. By the time he reached Chicago General, he was awake and irritated, which made him seem less frightening than he was. He kept apologizing for taking up space. His coat was wet at the shoulders. A thin crescent of blood had dried above his eyebrow. He told the admitting nurse he had hit his head, but he insisted he had not blacked out. His vitals were not alarming. His blood pressure was high, but not strange for someone in pain. His pulse was steady. Oxygen was fine. He answered questions. He knew his name, the date, and where he was. He complained more about his left wrist than his head. The room relaxed around him. That was when Sarah began to worry. It was not one dramatic sign. It rarely was. Daniel's eyes followed voices half a beat too slowly. When Sarah asked him to squeeze her fingers, his right hand responded quickly, but the left seemed to need permission from somewhere far away. His wife, who had arrived breathless and still wearing her work apron under her coat, said he was always joking when he was nervous. But Daniel was not joking. He was smiling in the polite way people smile when they understand that a reaction is expected but cannot quite locate the feeling behind it. Sarah asked him to repeat 3 words and remember them. He repeated 2. Then he looked embarrassed. It could have been pain. It could have been stress. It could have been the bright lights and the cold and the shock of falling. But something in Sarah's chest tightened. Years earlier, on a rescue call near the lakefront, she had pulled a man from a capsized boat who spoke clearly all the way to shore. He had laughed about losing his favorite hat. He had told them his wife's name, his address, the name of his dog. Then, while everyone around him believed the danger had passed, his gaze had drifted and his words had slowed, as if his thoughts were walking through deep snow. That man had survived because someone took the small change seriously. Sarah had never forgotten it. She went to find Dr. Robert Hayes. Hayes was the attending physician on duty that morning, a man with 30 years of hospital experience and a way of making every room rearrange itself around his certainty. He was not incompetent. That was part of what made him difficult. He knew medicine. He knew the language of authority. He knew when younger doctors were wrong, and because he had been right so often, he had developed the dangerous habit of believing doubt was something other people needed. To his admirers, he was decisive. To the staff beneath him, he was a weather system. Sarah found him outside Trauma 2, reviewing a chart while a resident waited for instructions. She kept her voice low. She told him Daniel Whitaker needed a head CT and a neuroconsult. She explained the delayed responses, the strange affect, the slight difference in grip, the memory issue that did not match his earlier presentation. Hayes did not look up at first. He said Daniel was being monitored. Sarah said monitoring was not enough. That made him look at her. There was a particular kind of silence that came from Dr. Hayes when he felt challenged. It did not sound angry yet. It sounded like a door being locked. He reminded her that Daniel had a minor head injury, stable vitals, and no documented loss of consciousness. Imaging was backed up. There were chest pains in the waiting room, a possible stroke, coming by ambulance, 2 flu admissions waiting for beds, and a psychiatric hold that had already taken 3 nurses out of rotation. Sarah listened. She knew the pressure was real. Then she said the thing that made his face change. She said Daniel might be bleeding in his brain. Not loudly, not theatrically, just clearly enough that the resident looked up. Dr. Hayes closed the chart. He told Sarah that nurses did not diagnose. Sarah said she was not diagnosing, she was escalating. Hayes's jaw tightened. He had spent years building a department where orders moved down, not sideways. To him, Sarah's concern was not just a clinical opinion. It was an interruption of hierarchy. It was a nurse forcing uncertainty into a decision he had already made in front of someone junior. And in hospitals, pride can disguise itself as procedure. He told her she was overstepping. Sarah held his gaze. She thought of Daniel's wife standing beside the bed, rubbing her cold hands together and trying not to imagine the worst. She thought of the half-second delay in Daniel's eyes. She thought of black water and a man laughing about a hat he almost never lived to replace. She asked for the scan again. This time, Hayes said her name like a warning. "You are exceeding your authority, Sarah." The resident looked down. A nurse passing by suddenly found a reason to turn the other way. Around them, the emergency department continued its usual noise. But for Sarah, the world narrowed to one impossible choice. She could step back. She could chart her concern, follow the order, keep the peace, and tell herself she had done enough. Or she could risk everything for a patient who might still turn out to be fine. This is the private agony of people who work in medicine. Not the dramatic emergencies everyone imagines, but the quieter moments when the evidence is not loud enough to protect you, when the machines have not yet screened, when the chain of command tells you to wait, and your experience tells you waiting may be the mistake. Sarah returned to Daniel's room. He was trying to tell his wife where he had parked the car, but he kept losing the sentence in the middle. His wife laughed nervously, hoping to make it normal. Daniel laughed too, then winced. Sarah looked at him and made her decision. She contacted Dr. Amelia Chen, a neurosurgeon she had worked with before on complicated trauma cases. She did it quietly through the proper emergency consultation channel available for urgent nursing escalation, but without Hayes's blessing. She documented her observations. She noted the changes. She made the request impossible to ignore. Dr. Chen arrived 20 minutes later with the expression of someone who had not planned to be pulled into someone else's argument. But when she examined Daniel, her irritation disappeared. Sarah watched the shift happen. The focus, the small pause, the quick questions, the way Dr. Chen's eyes moved from Daniel's face to his hands to the monitor and back again. The scan was ordered. By the time the results came back, nobody was laughing. Daniel had a slow intracranial bleed. Not dramatic enough to crash his vitals yet. Not obvious enough for anyone who had already decided he was stable, but dangerous, growing. The kind of injury that can sit behind ordinary numbers until ordinary numbers are no longer available. He was moved quickly. The room that had been casual an hour earlier snapped into motion. Consent forms, calls, surgical preparation. Daniel's wife stopped pretending she was calm and pressed both hands over her mouth while Dr. Chen explained what needed to happen. Sarah stayed beside her long enough to say that they had found it in time. Only then did the woman cry. The surgery went well. Daniel lived. And Sarah Miller was suspended before the end of her shift. The meeting happened in a small administrative conference room with beige walls and a table that had seen too many conversations designed to sound fair. Sarah sat on one side. Dr. Hayes sat on the other, arms folded, anger polished into professionalism. The nursing supervisor looked exhausted before anyone spoke. No one said Daniel would have died if Sarah had stayed quiet. No one said the scan proved her concern was correct. Instead, the conversation circled around conduct, process, authority, chain of command. Dr. Hayes said Sarah had undermined medical leadership during an active shift. He said she had created confusion. He said patient safety depended on role clarity, as if role clarity had been the thing bleeding inside Daniel's skull. Sarah did not raise her voice. She asked whether Daniel was alive, because the concern had been escalated. The room went still. That was not the question they wanted on the table. The supervisor looked down at her notes. Dr. Hayes said outcomes did not justify insubordination. The administrator said a review would be conducted, but until then, Sarah would be placed on immediate suspension pending further action. Immediate suspension. After 15 years, after one saved life, the words landed with a clean, almost elegant cruelty. Sarah signed the acknowledgement form because refusing would not change it. She removed her badge because they asked for it. She returned to her locker and opened it slowly. Inside, everything was ordinary. That was what hurt. The half-pack of gum, the extra socks, the small photo of her sister's children taped to the door, a hospital holiday card from a patient who had come back walking after everyone feared he never would, the faded orange cord of the old whistle she had carried since her Coast Guard days. She placed each item in the cardboard box without drama. People saw her. Of course they saw her. Emergency departments are built on movement, but news moves faster than stretchers. By the time Sarah walked out, half the staff knew she had been suspended. Some looked stunned. Some looked ashamed. Some stared too long and then pretended they had not. A young nurse named Priya, whom Sarah had trained, opened her mouth as if to say something, but Dr. Hayes was standing near the charge desk, and Priya closed it again. That silence followed Sarah down the hall. It hurt more than Hayes, because Hayes was acting like the man he had already shown himself to be. But the others, the nurses who had watched Sarah take double assignments, cover breaks, catch dosage mistakes, sit with dying patients when family was still on the way, they knew. They knew and said nothing. Sarah did not look angry when security walked beside her. She looked tired. At the exit, the guard apologized under his breath. Sarah told him it was all right. It was not all right. Outside, the cold struck her face so hard her eyes watered. Snow gathered in her hair. The parking lot smelled like exhaust and salt. She shifted the cardboard box against her hip and started toward her car. Then the sirens came. At first, Sarah thought it was a standard multi-ambulance arrival. A winter morning in Chicago could produce injuries by the minute. Slips, collisions, carbon monoxide calls, heart attacks brought on by shoveling snow. But by the fourth ambulance, her steps slowed. By the sixth, she stopped. A paramedic jumped from the back of a rig and shouted for help. His jacket was crusted with ice. Blood ran down the side of his glove and froze dark against the cuff. He was not shouting the way paramedics shouted on a bad call. He was shouting the way people shout when the scale of the problem has outrun the plan. The security guard beside Sarah reached for his radio. Someone yelled that there had been a pileup on I-90. Then another voice said, 40 vehicles. Then another said, maybe more. The words reached Sarah in fragments, but fragments were enough. Whiteout conditions, cars crushed between semis, families trapped, a school van, multiple criticals. More ambulances coming. Fire still extricating. Roads backing up behind the crash. The emergency entrance filled with motion. Through the glass, Sarah could see the department tense and scatter. People ran toward the ambulance bay. Someone knocked over a supply bin. A resident moved the wrong way and almost collided with a stretcher. A patient already waiting in the hall lifted his head and watched the wave arrive. Sarah stood in the snow with the box in her arms. She had every reason to leave. No one could accuse her of abandoning a job she had just been told she no longer had. No one could demand loyalty from a person they had humiliated in front of her colleagues. She had given Chicago General 15 years, and the hospital had answered with a security escort. Her car was 20 yards away. The engine would be cold, but it would start. She could drive home slowly, make tea, sit at her kitchen table, and let the day break open in private. She could call her sister. She could call a lawyer. She could do what people are supposed to do after injustice, protect herself. Then the next stretcher rolled past. On it was a little girl with a purple winter hat slipping off one ear. Her cheeks were wet, and she kept asking for her father. The paramedic, holding pressure against her forehead, looked barely older than 25. His hands were steady, but his eyes were not. Behind them came a man with his coat cut open and his shirt soaked dark near the ribs. He was trying to lift his head, trying to say a woman's name. Then a firefighter stumbled through the bay doors with one arm wrapped against his body, refusing the stretcher because he said others were worse. Sarah felt something inside her go quiet. Not calm exactly, clear. She lowered the cardboard box to the snow beside the curb. The security guard stared at her. Sarah did not ask permission. She did not make a speech. She did not touch the badge that was no longer clipped to her chest. She walked back into Chicago General. The emergency department had changed in less than 5 minutes. Before the ambulances arrived, it had been busy. Now it was losing shape. Patients filled every bay. Stretchers crowded the corridor. Family members stood pressed against walls. A woman screamed for her son. A monitor alarm went unanswered long enough that 2 different people turned toward it, and neither could reach it. Wet boots left gray trails across the floor. Someone was calling for more blankets. Someone else was shouting that radiology was backed up. The waiting room doors kept opening as walk-in victims from the pileup arrived in shock, some bleeding, some limping, some not yet understanding they were hurt. This was the moment systems are supposed to handle. But systems are only as strong as the people willing to take responsibility inside them. Dr. Hayes was near the central desk, issuing orders faster than anyone could absorb them. He was trying to manage each patient as they entered, but the department needed something wider than one physician's reaction. It needed triage. It needed separation. It needed someone to see not the loudest injury, not the closest stretcher, not the most frightened family, but the whole field of danger at once. Sarah stopped at the threshold and took in the room. She counted bodies. She counted open beds. She counted nurses, doctors, paramedics, respiratory techs, transporters, and empty spaces where help should have been. Then she began. Her first order was not loud. It cut through because it was clean. She told 2 nurses to clear the hallway by moving the stable fluid missions into the observation area. She sent a resident to reassess every walk-in victim who had been seated because they were walking, because walking did not mean safe after high-speed impact. She pointed to the little girl in the purple hat and asked for pediatric vitals, warmth, and a neuro check. She moved the rib injury patient ahead of a man with a dramatic but controlled arm fracture because breath mattered more than bone. Someone said her name with surprise. Sarah did not answer. She took a roll of colored tape from a supply cart and started marking stretchers by priority when the formal tags ran short. Red for immediate, yellow for urgent but stable, green for walking wounded who still needed eyes on them. Black was left unused, and Sarah silently hoped it would stay that way. The young nurse Priya looked frozen beside the medication station, her hands full of syringes she had not yet labeled. Sarah caught her eye and gave her one task, not 10. 1. Start a medication log board. Names, bed numbers, times. Nothing leaves your hand without being written. Priya nodded, swallowed, and moved. That was how panic broke. Not by telling people to calm down, but by giving their hands something exact to do. Sarah moved through the department with the strange precision of a person who had lived this pattern before in another form. The ER was not a storm at sea, but the principles were familiar. Secure the living, find the hidden danger, use the strong where they can help. Protect the inexperienced from decisions too big to make alone. Keep the noise from choosing the priorities. Dr. Hayes saw her near Trauma 3. For one sharp second, his face hardened. He told her she was suspended. Sarah, checking a patient's airway as she listened to lung sounds, said she knew. He said she had no authorization to be in the department. Sarah looked up at him. Behind his shoulder, 2 paramedics were waiting with another critical patient because nobody had told them where to go. She said there were 40 people coming, and the department was already behind. Hayes stared at her as if the problem were her presence, not the collapsing room around him. But then the man with the rib injury began to struggle for breath, and the argument dissolved under the sound of necessity. Sarah turned away first, not because she had won, because somebody else needed air. From that moment on, people followed her because her instructions worked. She did not try to replace the doctors. She did not pretend to be what she was not. She put the right patients in front of the right clinicians. She kept nurses from being swallowed by 10 competing demands. She noticed when a quiet patient in the corner had stopped shivering, which in a snow crash could be worse than shaking. She told a clerk to write patient descriptions on a whiteboard when names were missing, because relatives would soon flood the hospital and chaos would double if nobody could match faces to calls. She found 3 warmed blankets and placed them over a teenage boy who kept insisting he was fine, though his lips were pale and his right pant leg was dark below the knee. She stopped a resident from sending an elderly woman to radiology before someone checked why her breathing had become shallow. She asked one of the paramedics which vehicles had been closest to the semi-impact. When he pointed to 3 stretchers, Sarah changed their priority before anyone argued. There are forms of intelligence that look ordinary because they are built from repetition. Sarah's was like that. It did not announce itself. It assembled details. The smell of gasoline on a coat. The way a patient protected the left side of his abdomen while claiming his shoulder hurt. The child who cried loudly. And the child who did not cry at all. The worker whose hands were too cold to clip a pulse oximeter correctly. The family member who kept repeating the same question because shock had trapped her in one thought. Sarah saw them, not as scenery, as data, as human beings whose smallest changes mattered. And slowly the department found a rhythm. It was not peaceful. Nothing about that morning became peaceful. But order began to form around Sarah's voice. Trauma 1 took the most unstable chest injury. Trauma 2 took the patient with suspected internal bleeding. The pediatric room received the little girl in the purple hat, whose name turned out to be Emily, and whose father was still trapped at the crash scene. The hallway was divided into zones. Respiratory needs near oxygen. Walking wounded away from ambulance flow. Families in one area with a social worker and updates every 15 minutes. Because fear without information becomes its own emergency. Sarah even remembered the patients who had been there before the pileup. A woman with chest pain who could not be forgotten just because she had arrived before the headline. A diabetic man waiting too long without food or insulin. Daniel Whitaker's wife, still upstairs after his surgery, who would later hear that the nurse who saved her husband had been escorted out and had walked back in anyway. At some point, Sarah found herself beside Dr. Hayes again. He was putting in an order with forced concentration. His face looked older than it had that morning. The certainty had thinned, replaced by the strain of a man realizing that command and control were not the same thing. For a few seconds, they worked within arm's reach without speaking. Then a firefighter was brought in. He was conscious, but barely. His helmet was gone. Soot and slush streaked his face. One side of his turnout coat had been cut away. He had a shoulder injury, maybe worse, and a line of blood near his hairline. Even hurt, he seemed furious that anyone had made him stop working. Sarah stepped toward him with a blanket and a quick assessment. He blinked at her. At first, his eyes were unfocused. Then something in them sharpened. He whispered a name. Sarah thought he was asking for someone else. Then he said it louder. Captain Miller. The words did what no alarm had done all morning. They stopped the room. Not completely. Nothing stopped completely in an emergency department. But heads turned. Priya looked up from the medication board. A resident glanced at Sarah, then at the firefighter. Dr. Hayes paused with his hand still on the charting station. Sarah's expression barely changed. She told the firefighter not to talk. He ignored her the way injured rescue workers often do when gratitude outruns pain. He told the room she had pulled his crew through a storm off the lake years ago. He said their rescue boat had taken damage in freezing water, visibility gone radio, breaking one man overboard and another tangled in line. He said people had already started using the language people use when they are preparing for a loss. Difficult conditions, limited window, uncertain survival. Then Sarah Miller had taken command, not with drama, not with speeches, with the same clipped instructions she was using now. Secure him. Count again. Watch the left side. Do not waste light. Move when I tell you. The firefighter's voice cracked. He said if she had waited for someone else to be comfortable with her authority, his crew would not have come home. Sarah touched his shoulder, partly to comfort him, partly to stop him from spending breath. But it was too late. The room had heard. For 15 years, most of Chicago General had known Sarah Miller as an emergency nurse. Some knew she was former Coast Guard, in the vague way people know facts they do not bother to imagine. They did not know what it meant. They did not picture her standing on a deck slick with ice, shouting over wind. They did not picture her choosing between two bad options with lives attached to both. They did not picture that calm had been carved into her by weather, water loss, and responsibility. Now they did. Priya stared at her as if seeing a different person inside the same familiar scrubs. One of the residents whispered almost to himself that he had no idea. Dr. Hayes said nothing. Sarah moved the firefighter into evaluation and told the team what to check first. The moment passed, because emergencies do not pause for biography. But something had changed. People began listening faster. When Sarah said a patient was too quiet, someone came. When she said a bed had to be cleared, it was cleared. When she told the clerk to call the blood bank again and use the words mass casualty, nobody asked whether she had the authority. Authority had arrived in the only form that mattered: competence under pressure. The next hour tested everyone. More victims came from the crash scene. Some were snow-covered and silent. Others were awake enough to be terrified. One man insisted his wife had been right behind him, though no one had matched her to any stretcher yet. A bus driver kept apologizing to passengers who were not in the room. A college student with glass in her hair asked whether her phone had been found, because her mother would worry if she did not answer. Sarah let herself feel none of it fully in the moment. Feeling everything in a crisis can drown action. Feeling nothing can make you careless. Sarah had learned to let emotion stand at the edge of her awareness, close enough to remind her these were lives, far enough not to take the wheel. She found Emily's father listed under an unknown male from Vehicle 14 and pushed the information to the social worker before the child heard rumors from a hallway. She noticed that the man calling for his wife was not only scared but becoming confused, and she moved him up for evaluation. She took 30 seconds to hand water to a nurse whose lips were cracked from talking non-stop, because workers collapse too when nobody tends the tenders. At one point, the hospital's chief administrator arrived, tie loosened, face pale. Behind him came the director of emergency services, who had been across campus when the pileup call came in. They stepped into the department expecting to find command under Dr. Hayes. What they saw was stranger. Hayes was working and working hard, but the pattern of the room was not his. The whiteboard had Sarah's handwriting. The zones had Sarah's logic. The nurses were moving on Sarah's assignments. The residents were reporting changes to Sarah before she sent them to the appropriate physician. The paramedics arriving from the crash scene were giving Sarah the field picture, because she asked the questions that helped them unload the next problem before it hit the doors. The administrator recognized her immediately and frowned. He knew she had been suspended. He had signed the temporary order less than an hour earlier because Dr. Hayes had insisted the matter could not wait. Now the suspended nurse was standing in the center of the worst emergency Chicago General had faced in years, directing flow with blood on one sleeve and snow melting in her hair. He started toward her. Before he reached her, a monitor alarm sounded in the pediatric room. Sarah turned and ran. Emily, the girl in the purple hat, had become suddenly drowsy. Her earlier scans and checks had not suggested catastrophe, but children can compensate until they cannot. Sarah did not crowd the doctor. She gave the change, clearly called for the pediatric team, and got the child's mother on the phone through a social worker so consent and history could move together. She kept the room from filling with useless fear. Emily stabilized. It took 16 minutes. For those 16 minutes, nobody cared about Sarah's employment status. When she came back out, the administrator was waiting. Dr. Hayes stood a few feet behind him, stiff and silent. The administrator asked who had established the triage plan. For a moment, no one answered. That silence was different from the one that had followed Sarah down the hallway earlier. This time, people were not hiding. They were looking at one another, measuring the cost of telling the truth, and perhaps remembering the cost of not telling it. Priya spoke first. She said Nurse Miller did. Then one of the residents said Sarah had reorganized the critical flow. A paramedic added that she had caught 3 high-risk patients before they were under-prioritized. The respiratory therapist said the oxygen zone move kept them from losing track of who needed immediate support. The social worker said the family system prevented a second wave of panic. Even the young security guard, still near the ambulance entrance because nobody had told him what else to do, said Sarah had been outside when the call came in and had come back by choice. Each sentence landed like a hand placed on the same side of a scale. Sarah did not speak. She looked exhausted. There was a smear of blood at her wrist where her glove had torn. Her hair had come loose from its clip. Her shoes were wet from the parking lot in the ambulance bay. She did not look like a hero. She looked like a nurse at the end of a brutal shift. That made the truth harder to avoid. The administrator turned to Dr. Hayes. Hayes's face had gone red, but not with the anger from earlier. This was something less controlled. Shame, maybe, or the humiliation of realizing that the hierarchy he had protected all morning had depended on a woman he had tried to remove. He said there would be time to discuss procedure later. Sarah looked at him then, not triumphantly, not cruelly, just steadily. And for the first time that day, Dr. Hayes looked away. By early evening, the first wave of the I-90 pileup had passed through Chicago General. Not every outcome was perfect. In a disaster, perfection is a fantasy people invent afterward because the truth is too heavy. Some patients went to surgery, some to intensive care. Some were transferred. Some families received news that changed the shape of every day that would follow. But the department did not collapse. 40 victims were assessed, stabilized, routed, treated, or transferred with a speed that later reviewers would describe as extraordinary given the conditions. Several doctors would privately admit that without the early triage changes, the quiet, critical patients might have waited behind the loud injuries too long. By then, Daniel Whitaker was waking from surgery. His wife, Marlene, learned what had happened in pieces. First, that the bleed had been found in time. Then, that the nurse who had insisted on the scan had been suspended for pushing the concern. Then, that the same nurse had walked back into the hospital during the pileup and helped manage the crisis. Marlene asked to see her. Sarah did not want to go at first. There were still charts to finish, still staff to check on, still a dozen small loose ends that tugged at her more comfortably than gratitude. But Dr. Chen found her near the supply room and told her Daniel's wife was asking, so Sarah went. Marlene was sitting beside Daniel's bed, holding his hand, as if she had decided not to let the world borrow him again. Daniel was pale and groggy, with bandages and monitors making him look more fragile than he had that morning. But he was alive. His chest rose and fell. His fingers moved weakly around his wife's. Marlene stood when Sarah entered. For a second, she could not speak. Then she hugged Sarah with the sudden force of someone who had almost lost everything and had no polite way to express the distance between almost and did not. Sarah closed her eyes. It was the first moment all day when she allowed herself to feel tired. Marlene thanked her, not in the vague way patients thank hospitals, but directly. She thanked Sarah for noticing, for insisting, for not letting embarrassment or authority or fear become larger than Daniel's life. Sarah said she was glad they caught it. Marlene pulled back and looked at her carefully. She said the hospital should be ashamed. Sarah did not answer. There are truths that do not need decoration. When Sarah returned downstairs, the emergency department had entered the strange quiet after a storm. Not quiet like peace. Quiet like a room full of people who have been shouting inside their own bodies for hours and are only now remembering to breathe. The floors were being mopped. Empty packaging overflowed from bins. Staff leaned against walls with paper cups of coffee gone cold in their hands. Someone had brought sandwiches, and nobody could remember from where. The whiteboard still held Sarah's triage marks: red, yellow, green. Names added, crossed, rewritten. A record of pressure and survival. Dr. Hayes stood near the charge desk, reading nothing on a chart. For a moment, Sarah thought he might speak. He did not. Instead, the hospital administrator asked Sarah to come with him. The second meeting happened in the same conference room as the first. That was almost cruel by accident. The beige walls, the polished table, the chairs that made everyone sit a little too straight. Only now the room held different people. The chief administrator was there, the director of emergency services, the nursing supervisor, Dr. Chen, Dr. Hayes. Sarah sat down with the same cardboard box on the floor beside her chair. No one seemed willing to look at it. The administrator began with the language institutions use when they are afraid of admitting too much too quickly. He said there had been developments. He said the hospital would be reviewing the circumstances of Sarah's suspension. He said her actions during the mass casualty event had been noted. Sarah listened without expression. Then Dr. Chen interrupted him. She said Daniel Whitaker would likely have died or suffered catastrophic injury if Sarah had not escalated. The room went still. Dr. Chen was not loud. She did not need to be. Surgeons often carry a kind of authority even administrators dislike interrupting. She explained briefly and clinically that Sarah's observations were specific, documented, and correct. She said the consultation had been appropriate. She said the question was not whether Sarah had embarrassed a physician, but why the system had made embarrassment more powerful than a patient's safety. No one answered quickly. The nursing supervisor's eyes shone, though she kept her voice steady when she spoke. She admitted she should have pushed harder before signing off on the suspension. She said nurses had been afraid to challenge Hayes because they had seen what happened to people who did. That was the sentence that changed the temperature of the room, because now Sarah's suspension was no longer an isolated conflict. It was evidence of a culture. Dr. Hayes shifted in his chair. He said everyone was tired. He said emotions were high. He said protocols existed for a reason, and medicine could not become a free-for-all where every staff member bypassed authority based on instinct. Sarah finally spoke. She said instinct was not a guess when it was built from training documentation and 15 years of bedside observation. She said she had not asked anyone to ignore medicine. She had asked them to look again. There was no anger in her voice, and that made it harder for him to dismiss. Anger can be labeled unprofessional. Calm truth has fewer handles. She looked at the administrator and said, Daniel Whitaker was not alive because she broke the chain of command. He was alive because the chain of command was not allowed to become a wall. The administrator folded his hands. Then he did what he should have done that morning. He listened. Sarah's suspension was rescinded before she left the room, but reinstatement was not enough. For years, people at Chicago General had treated speaking up as a personality trait. Some were brave, some were difficult, some were quiet, some were troublemakers. After that day, the hospital began treating it as a safety system. The administrator ordered a formal review of clinical escalation across departments. A new policy was drafted requiring urgent concerns from nurses, paramedics, respiratory therapists, and other frontline staff to be documented, acknowledged, and reviewed by a second clinician when patient deterioration was reasonably suspected. No staff member could be disciplined for good faith escalation without independent review. Anonymous reporting channels were strengthened. Mass casualty training was redesigned using what had happened during the I-90 pileup, and Dr. Robert Hayes was placed under internal investigation. The consequences were not theatrical. He was not dragged out. There was no public scene in the lobby, no dramatic confession into a microphone. Real accountability often looks less satisfying from a distance and more difficult up close. His cases were reviewed. Complaints from nurses that had been softened or buried were reopened. Residents were interviewed. Patterns emerged. Not one mistake, a pattern. A pattern of dismissing concerns when they came from people below him. A pattern of punishing questions that challenged his certainty. A pattern of confusing respect with obedience. In the end, Hayes stepped down from his leadership role in the emergency department. He remained a physician for a time under supervision and required professional remediation, but he no longer controlled the culture he had used as a shield. Some staff thought that was too little. Some thought it was too much. Sarah did not build her healing around his punishment. That surprised people. They expected her to want a speech, a ceremony, maybe an apology in front of the same colleagues who had watched her leave. And part of them wanted it for themselves, because applause can make witnesses feel better about their earlier silence. Sarah asked for something else. She asked that every new nurse in the department be trained on the escalation policy during orientation. She asked that mass casualty drills include nurses and support staff in leadership roles, not as background hands. She asked that Daniel Whitaker's case be used, with family permission, as an example of why subtle neurological changes had to be taken seriously. And she asked that the young staff who froze during the pileup not be shamed, but trained. That was Sarah Miller's version of justice. Not a room bowing to her. A room becoming safer because of what it had been forced to learn. The morning after the pileup, Sarah returned to Chicago General before sunrise. Nobody had told her she needed to come in that early. In fact, several people had suggested she take a day, maybe two. The administrator had called it appropriate under the circumstances, which was one of those phrases that sounds compassionate because it is too vague to argue with. But Sarah woke at 4:18 a.m., stared at the ceiling, and knew sleep was finished. Her apartment was small and quiet. Snow still tapped against the windows. On the kitchen table, her cardboard box sat where she had left it after finally coming home. She had been too tired to unpack it, too restless to ignore it. The orange cord of the old whistle had slipped between a stack of cards and the travel mug. Sarah picked it up. For years, she had kept that whistle as a private thing, not a trophy, not proof. More like a reminder that when everything becomes loud, the first job is to create a signal clear enough for others to follow. She held it in her palm for a moment, then tucked it into the back of a drawer. She did not need to carry the past visibly. It had already done its work. At the hospital, the night shift was ending. The air smelled of coffee, disinfectant, and the faint metallic tiredness that lives in emergency rooms after hard nights. Sarah walked through the staff entrance in a clean uniform, her hair pinned back, her shoes dry, her badge newly reactivated and clipped to her chest. The first person to see her was Priya. The young nurse stood near the medication station with 2 cups of coffee. She looked as if she had been waiting and trying not to look like she was waiting. She handed one to Sarah. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Priya apologized, not in a dramatic way, not with a speech she had practiced for an audience. She said she was sorry she had not said anything when Sarah was escorted out. She said she had been afraid. She said that was not an excuse. Sarah took the coffee. She told Priya fear was real. Then she added that the next time it would be her job to decide what she did with it. Priya nodded. That was forgiveness in Sarah's language, not erasing the failure, giving the person a way to grow beyond it. As Sarah moved through the department, people looked at her differently, not with pity, not with the awkward sympathy people offer when they do not want to get involved. With respect, quiet, embarrassed, grateful respect. A transporter who had barely spoken to her before opened the supply room door without being asked. A resident thanked her for the triage plan and admitted he had never understood how quickly a department could lose control. The respiratory therapist said she had written down the oxygen zone system because it should be part of future drills. At the end of the hall, Dr. Hayes stood outside a workroom. He looked like a man who had slept badly, if he had slept at all. Sarah could have walked past him. Part of her wanted to. He stepped into the hall and said her name. The department seemed to lower its volume around them, though no one openly stopped. Hayes said he had been wrong. It was not the kind of apology that heals everything. Those do not exist. He did not suddenly become humble because one day had exposed him. He did not repair years of fear with one sentence. But his voice had lost the hard edge Sarah knew too well. And for the first time, he did not speak to her as if her role made her smaller than her knowledge. He said Daniel Whitaker was alive because she spoke up. He said the department had survived the pileup because she came back. Then he said he was sorry. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. She thought of the meeting the badge, the silence, the cold air outside, the little girl on the stretcher, the firefighter saying, "Captain Miller," with blood on his face. She thought of how easy it would be to make this moment about victory. But victory was too small for what the day had cost. She told Hayes his apology needed to become behavior. Then she went to check on her patients. Weeks passed. The story of the suspended nurse spread through the hospital in the way hospital stories do, part fact, part awe, part warning. By the time it reached the cafeteria, some versions had Sarah standing on a desk and commanding the entire building. In others, she personally performed 3 surgeries and delivered a baby in the elevator. Sarah corrected those stories when she heard them, usually with one raised eyebrow and a sentence that brought everyone back to earth. She had not saved everyone. She had not worked alone. She had not replaced the doctors. She had helped the team function when the team was close to breaking. That distinction mattered to her because the real lesson was not that one extraordinary nurse should be worshipped. It was that hospitals become dangerous when ordinary expertise is ignored until disaster makes it visible. Daniel Whitaker came back 3 months later. He walked slowly with a cane he hated and a knitted cap pulled low over the surgical scar he was self-conscious about. Marlene walked beside him, one hand hovering near his elbow, though he kept telling her he could manage. They brought a thank you card and a box of pastries from the bakery where Marlene worked. Daniel remembered almost nothing from the morning of his fall. He remembered cold. He remembered Sarah's face leaning into view. He remembered being embarrassed because he could not recall 3 simple words. That was all. But he knew the rest because Marlene had told him. Many times, probably more than he asked. She had told him about the nurse who saw what the numbers hid, the doctor who dismissed her, the scan, the surgery, the suspension, the crash, the return. When Daniel saw Sarah, he became quiet. He tried to make a joke, something about causing trouble, but his voice failed halfway through. He took her hand instead. His grip was uneven, but warm. He thanked her for the life he was still in. Sarah smiled then, a small, tired, real smile most of the department had rarely seen. She told him to keep doing his therapy. Daniel laughed and said she sounded like Marlene. Marlene said that was because they were both right. The moment lasted less than 5 minutes. Then Sarah was called away to a new arrival, because hospitals do not pause, even for the beautiful parts. But later, when she opened the card, she found Daniel had written one sentence in careful, slightly shaky handwriting. "Thank you for hearing the danger before it got loud." Sarah kept that card in her locker, not because she needed proof that she had been right, because it named the work. Months later, the I-90 pileup review was presented to the hospital board. The report included response times, patient outcomes, staffing gaps, equipment shortages, communication failures, and recommendations. It was thorough and dry in the way official documents tend to be. But buried inside the timeline was a section about informal leadership during the first hour. Sarah's name appeared there, not as a miracle, as a finding. The hospital had failed to properly recognize and integrate experienced nursing judgment into emergency command structure. That sentence did not sound emotional, but to the nurses who read it, it felt like a door opening. After that, Chicago General changed in ways outsiders would not notice. A new nurse concern pathway was posted in every unit. The phrase, "look again," became part of department language, not as a challenge, but as a safety practice. In mass casualty drills, nurses rotated through coordination roles. Residents were taught to ask bedside staff what worried them before closing a case. A red badge card was issued to every clinical employee with steps for urgent escalation. It did not make the hospital perfect. No policy can remove ego from human beings. No training can prevent every silence. But it gave courage somewhere to stand, and that matters. One evening, nearly a year after the snowstorm, Sarah was asked to speak to a group of new nurses. She almost refused. She disliked speeches. She disliked being turned into a symbol. Symbols are easier to admire than listen to. But Priya, who had become more confident and had started mentoring new hires herself, told Sarah the group needed to hear from her. So Sarah stood in a small classroom with tired fluorescent lights and a projector that hummed too loudly. She looked at the new nurses, some eager, some nervous, some already wearing the cautious expression of people learning that care work is both sacred and exhausting. She did not tell them to be fearless. That would have been dishonest. She told them they would be afraid of being wrong, afraid of being labeled difficult, afraid of angering someone powerful, afraid of making a call that later looked unnecessary. Then she told them the greater danger was training themselves not to notice, because the body whispers before it screams. A patient whispers before they collapse. A system whispers before it fails. And if you practice ignoring whispers long enough, you may one day stand in the middle of a disaster and realize you have forgotten how to hear. The room was very quiet. Sarah looked at them and said their job was not to win arguments. It was not to collect heroic moments. It was to protect life with skill, humility, documentation, teamwork, and the courage to say, "Look again," when something did not fit. That was all. No grand ending. No applause at first. Just silence. Then the sound of pens moving across paper. Sarah preferred that. Years from now, most people would not remember the exact policy number that came from that winter day. They would not remember the administrative review or the official language of the report. Some would not remember Daniel Whitaker's name or the color of Emily's hat or the firefighter's injured shoulder, but they would remember the shape of what happened. A nurse was punished for speaking up. A storm brought 40 lives to the door. The hospital that had pushed her out needed the very judgment it had dismissed, and Sarah Miller came back anyway. That is the part people returned to when they told the story. Not simply that she was right. Not simply that Dr. Hayes was wrong. Those things mattered, but they were not the deepest truth. The deepest truth was that Sarah had been handed a clean excuse to protect only herself. She did not take it. She placed her box in the snow and walked toward the people who needed help. There are moments in life when character is not announced. It is revealed by direction. Which way you turn when you have every reason to walk away. Which voice you obey when pride, fear, and pain are all speaking at once. Which responsibility you still honor after the people around you have failed to honor you. Sarah Miller did not need a title to become the person others followed. She had been a leader before anyone recognized it. In the Coast Guard, in the ER, in quiet rooms where a patient's pupils did not look right, in crowded hallways where panic needed a shape, in the soft, stubborn insistence that a life is worth one more look. And perhaps that is why her story stays with people. Because almost everyone knows what it feels like to be underestimated by someone who mistakes position for wisdom. Almost everyone knows the loneliness of seeing something wrong while others look away. Almost everyone has stood at least once with a choice between staying safe and speaking the truth. Sarah's story does not tell us that speaking up will always be rewarded immediately. It may cost you. It cost her dignity for a moment. It cost her comfort. It cost her the illusion that years of service would protect her from being misunderstood. But it also saved Daniel Whitaker. It helped save a department full of strangers. And it forced a hospital to become better than the pride of one man. Real strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is a nurse checking a hand squeeze twice. Sometimes it is a documented concern that refuses to disappear. Sometimes it is a cardboard box left in the snow because there is no time to be wounded when someone else cannot breathe. Titles can be taken. Badges can be deactivated. Names can be removed from schedules. But competence, courage, and conscience do not disappear because someone in authority refuses to recognize them. Sarah Miller walked into Chicago General that morning as a nurse most people thought they already knew. She walked out, suspended, humiliated, and alone. Then the sirens came, and by the time the snow stopped falling, everyone in that hospital understood something they should have known long before. The person they had silenced was the one who had been listening the whole time. If Sarah Miller's story moved you, leave this line in the comments. Real competence does not need a title. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, stay with us for more stories about courage, quiet integrity, and the people who changed lives without ever asking to be called heroes.